If you're obsessed with accuracy in your woodworking shop, then this Woodpeckers Saw Gauge is sure to thrill you. Let's take a closer look. There are all kinds of ways to test the alignment of table saw blades in fences relative to the miter slot. And most fall a little short simply because they depend on the accuracy of either a shop-built or a manufactured fixture riding in a miter slot which may or may not be perfectly and accurately milled. The Woodpeckers Saw Gauge, like all of their other tools, is milled to near jewel-like perfection. But more importantly, its design compensates for minor inaccuracies in the miter slot by using these precisely machined pins. In practice, the two pins are placed in the bottom of the miter slot, the larger pin is placed on top, and the geometry and laws of physics dictate that this middle pin will ride virtually perfectly up and down the middle of the miter slot. The saw gauge, by the way, will fit either 5/8 or 3/4 inch miter slots. Add to this novel miter slot centering system a machined block of aluminum and this precise dial indicator, and you now have a gauge assembly that'll give you a very accurate reading, whether or not there are any minor imperfections in the milling of the miter gauge slot. On the table saw, you can use the Woodpeckers Saw Gauge to determine alignment between the miter gauge slot and the blade. You can also use the gauge to determine the alignment of your fence. Both of these checks will help to assure clean, burn-free cuts and enhance safety by reducing the chance of binding or a kickback. So let's take a look at how the saw gauge works. Even though the Woodpeckers Saw Gauge compensates for minor imperfections in miter slots, I recommend you blow or brush away any sawdust that might be in the miter slot before starting. Then simply place these two pins on the bottom of the miter slot and place the larger pin on top, making sure that the grooves in the larger pin have captured the smaller pins. You can just apply a little downward pressure and slide the pins back and forth to make sure they're properly seated. Then pick one of the notches on the back side of the saw gauge that will have the dial indicator pin in contact with the blade and still allow it a bit of back and forth travel. Then press down lightly to hold the gauge in place. Move the gauge to the beginning of the saw blade and adjust the bezel on the gauge until the 0 lines up with the needle. Now slide the whole thing back to the back edge of the blade and look at the reading. If the needle moved in a clockwise direction, that means that the blade is a little further away from the miter slot on the outfeed end. In this case, it's actually a little closer, but it's less than 1/1000th of an inch. So we're well within tolerance. Now let's check the fence. Again, we drop the two small pins into the miter slot, place the larger pin on top, making sure these grooves are capturing the smaller pins underneath. Then we place the saw gauge on top using the notch that will allow us some free travel on the pin on the gauge. Now I'll slide it back, adjust the bezel to 0, and slide forward. The first thing you'll notice is there's actually some waviness to the face of my fence, something I'll definitely have to look into. But as I get back towards the back on the outfeed side, you'll see that the gauge has moved clockwise and it's about 3/1000ths, almost 3/1000ths kicked out. And a lot of woodworkers like this because it helps reduce binding, particularly when cutting longer, hard pieces of wood. So that's how the saw gauge is used with the table saw. When you're done with it, Woodpeckers provides this nice padded case for all of the parts so that you can protect this fine instrument. Before we pack it up though for the night, let's go take a look at some other ways I've found to use the Woodpeckers Saw Gauge. Of course, you could easily line up the fence on your router table exactly the same way as you do with your table saw. But another use for this is that some woodworkers like to bring the back half of their fence forward a little bit, put in a straight bit, and use their router table as a jointer. And that works really nice. Imagine if you could set it so precisely by taking a measurement, setting the bezel to 0, then just pull back on the pin, go to the other side of the fence and take a reading and know exactly how many thousandths of an inch you had moved the fence either forward or back for your jointing operation. Pretty slick, huh? On my drill press table, the fence is mounted with 2 large thumb screws in 2 open slots. And it's not easy to get the fence exactly perpendicular to these slots. And while it's not always necessary when drilling holes to have your fence perpendicular to the slots, sometimes when you're making repetitive holes in a very precise piece, it is advantageous to have your fence square. It's hard to do, but with the Woodpecker Saw Gauge, it's actually quite easy. Now just take the large roller and place it here in the groove, set the saw gauge in place, and then I take my Woodpecker's square, hold it against the fence, and slide it up to the saw gauge. Then holding that, I can move the saw gauge back and forth, and any movement of the needle will tell me whether or not my fence is perpendicular to this slot, and will also tell me which way I need to move it to make it perpendicular. Oh, that's pretty good. A little bit more. Ah, there we go, right there. All I got to do is tighten it down, and I'm perfectly perpendicular between the fence and this slot. The Woodpecker's Saw Gauge is a highly precise and very versatile instrument that I'm sure you'll find dozens of uses for in your shop. Thank you for watching this Highland Woodworking product tour video.